No link there. But welcome, good morning. My name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Vice President here at the center that directs our Europe program. And we could not be more pleased than to be hosting Commissioner Věra Jourová, Commissioner for Justice, Consumers, and Gender Equality at the European Union. We have an exciting partnership with the European Union delegation here as part of a policy and outreach partnership, and it's indeed our first programming under this exciting partnership. What we're going to do, I'm going to briefly introduce the Commissioner. She will offer some remarks. We'll take a few questions right after her remarks, and then we're going to do a bit of a set change. We're going to invite then a wonderful group of panelists to dive into the questions of U.S.-EU data cooperation and get into a much more substantive discussion. So that is how we are going to proceed this morning. Let me begin by giving you a headline that I read from Bloomberg on March the 2nd. Here was the headline: "If Trump spoils Privacy Pact, we'll pull it," EU official warns. And Commissioner Jourová later said, "I will not hesitate to do it. There's too much at stake." And I thought those words were the right way to think about this important privacy shield and U.S.-European data protection. There is simply too much at stake. We're delighted to host Commissioner Jourová, who prior to becoming the Commissioner in 2014 served as the Minister for Regional Development in the Czech Republic. Her life has been dedicated to both private sector work and in trade, but also in public service, so uniquely qualified to have this portfolio. She has been nicknamed the Privacy Czar, so I don't know whether she accepts that title or not, but with your applause, please join me in welcoming Commissioner Jourová.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me and also my team here to this important event and to enable me to speak on the very topical issues of transatlantic data flows and the protection of personal data. And thank you also for having this weather for us, because this caused that we really feel like home. This is how we have it in Brussels all the time. So I will start rather sadly, because on my previous visit to Washington in 2015, Paris has just been struck by terrorist attacks. In a rather sad turn of events, here I am again in Washington, 1 week after the attack in London that killed 4 people and left 40 others wounded. And the attack unfolded over Westminster Bridge in the shadow of Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament, the very symbols of democracy. Democracy, our way of life and our values of tolerance were once again struck at the heart of the day. The European Union and the United States are united in their resolve to defend our free societies against crime and terrorism. This is why our transatlantic dialogue on these issues is so important. More than ever, we need to cooperate and protect our respective citizens from common security threats. But in doing so, we need to reconcile security interests and upholding fundamental rights. One of our common achievements in this respect in the EU-U.S. umbrella agreement on protecting personal information exchanged as part of law enforcement cooperation. This agreement includes information on suspects and convicted persons, but also innocent victims and witnesses. The umbrella agreement, which came into force on the 1st February this year, is a big improvement compared to the past situation when our information exchanges were subject to fragmented and often rather weak protections, which caused legal uncertainty and exposed them to legal challenges. With the Umbrella Agreement, we now have a common transatlantic privacy framework based on high standards. This will support and facilitate law enforcement cooperation by building trust and legal certainty for data transfers. We can be proud of this achievement, which is also a major precedent and will serve as a model for similar arrangements in the area of law enforcement cooperation. Now that this major agreement has entered into force, we must ensure that it is fully and effectively implemented on both sides of the Atlantic. This is something we owe our citizens and their right to privacy, but it is also crucial for effective, rapid and secure law enforcement cooperation. 2 days ago, I discussed this with my counterpart here, the Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and we understood each other very well that we need the Umbrella Agreement running and fulfilling its main purpose. Now I'd like to speak about something connected also with the criminal justice sphere, and this is the electronic evidence. Today, access to digital evidence often provides the only lead in investigating or prosecuting crime. If access to evidence can be tricky at national level, it is even more so when the data is stored outside of the country of the investigating authorities. EU member states are exploring ways of addressing this problem, either through traditional instruments such as mutual legal assistance or alternative tools such as direct requests to companies. Access to electronic evidence raises many questions, from jurisdictional issues to the protection of personal data. In Europe, among the 28 justice ministers, there is a growing consensus for a common approach with clear criteria that would also provide legal certainty for business. I am also fully committed to further pursue our transatlantic dialogue on this topic, both with the government and internet service providers in the United States. E-evidence was another topic we discussed with Jeff Sessions 2 days ago, and we promised to each other to continue this dialogue in the coming months. For all the useful information and opportunities it provides us with, the internet can also be used as a channel to spread messages of hatred and cause to violence. Over recent years, racism, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance have been growing and spreading across Europe at very high speed. That's why the European Union rejects and condemns all forms of intolerance and incitement to hatred and violence. They do not belong in our societies. I want the internet to remain a place of free and democratic expression where the law is fully respected. The rule of law must apply online just as it does offline. In May last year, I agreed with Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Microsoft on a code of conduct to counter illegal hate speech online. These IT companies committed to review and assess most of the notifications of illegal hate speech in less than 24 hours. We are currently monitoring how the code is implemented, and I expect the results to be released by the end of May. A lack of progress may challenge the effectiveness of self-regulation in this area and may increase the pressure to legislate. I would like to clarify one thing. Working on this doesn't mean that we do not value as the number one principle the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech. We speak about the takedowns of illegal content, of the open calls for violence which are prohibited in European Union by the law. That's why we discuss with the IT companies, not only with those 4 ones, but with the whole IT sector, that, as I said before, Internet must remain and must be the space where we have rule of law in place. I'd like now to continue by telling you something new about our General Data Protection Regulation, about the European Data Protection Reform, which will come into force in 2018, in May. I understood from several debates I had here in Washington, this is in the center of the concerns of some companies operating on the European market, and that's why I think it's very, very important that we communicate more intensively with the companies and with the Chamber of Commerce and the other associations about how, what is the best way to implement the new rules. We are convinced that we have created through this General Data Protection Regulation modern 21st century rules, the rules which are fully adapted to the digital age. And by doing so, we will swap the 28 different set of national laws with one single set of rules for Europe's digital single market. This good for the protection of the individual and good for innovation and business across the EU, including for American companies doing business in Europe. We are currently working closely with member states, with the data protection authorities and with businesses to ensure effective implementation in practice. And we need to get this right together with the member states and with the businesses. This is our common task. This brings me to my last point, which is the privacy shield. In a world where cross-border data flows have become a central feature of global trade, strong data protection rules would be meaningless if the data can travel abroad without protections. This applies in the transatlantic context as in any other trading relationship. At the same time, while the EU and the United States both protect privacy and personal data, our approaches in how to safeguard these rights differ in some respects. The privacy shield, like the umbrella agreement in the law enforcement area, shows that it is possible to bridge those differences. I am pleased to see that a growing number of US companies have endorsed this framework. Almost 2,000 of them have already signed up to the Privacy Shield. This framework has enormous potential to strengthen the transatlantic economy and also reaffirm our shared values. But we now have to ensure that it keeps working as it should. Two things are important here. First, we have to ensure that the key foundations of the Privacy Shield remain in place. This concerns in particular the area of government access for national security reasons. Maintaining the limitations and safeguards in this area is crucial. For instance, there would be no Privacy Shield without Presidential Policy Directive number 28, and also without the establishment and full functioning of the Ombudsperson's Office. Both are central elements of the representations and commitments on which the framework is built. And we will also follow closely this year's debates around the reform of Section 702 FISA and how this will affect the data of Europeans. And second, we have to ensure the proper day-to-day implementation and robust follow-up of the Privacy Shield. Companies have to comply with their obligations, and this needs to be reflected in their daily operations. And the public authorities that oversee the privacy shield, both here and back in Europe, have to monitor such compliance and help individuals exercising their rights. Yesterday, Commerce Secretary Ross and I agreed that the first annual joint review of the Privacy Shield will take in September this year. This will be an important milestone where we need to check that everything is in place and working well. If we want to further consolidate this new transatlantic bridge, we need the active engagement and contribution of all interested parties to this review, to this first review, which will be crucial for continuing of this mechanism. Ladies and gentlemen, transatlantic data flows have come a long way. The umbrella agreement and the privacy shield will benefit our citizens and businesses, provided they continue to be properly and fully implemented. I have come here to engage with my new counterparts in this spirit. I am happy that we have made a positive start this week and reaffirmed our common commitments. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Commissioner has been very kind in taking a question or two. We just can probably take about 2 questions. If you'll please raise your hand and identify yourself, you get to ask the Commissioner. Yes, sir, right there. There's a microphone coming to you. Sorry. Thank you. Yes, sir, please.
Good morning. My name is Carl Schoenmaker with the Software Information Industry Association.
No, it may not be on. I'm sorry. No.
Hello.
I'll just speak very, very loud.
That will work. Thank you. Sorry.
Good morning.
Morning.
Commissioner, welcome to Washington. My name is Carl Schoenmaker. I work with the Software Information Industry Association. We're very, very supportive of the Privacy Shield. We've worked on it in many, many different ways, including Judicial Redress Act, many, many things over the past couple of years. Very good news about the review in September. I'm wondering what you hope to achieve with it, what kinds of information you'd like to see from industry, and do you have a date in September for it?
A little more specifics on the very important annual review.
Yes, we don't have much time, and we need to do a lot of work by September. What I want to achieve, I want to achieve true picture, and I want to translate this true picture into the real reflection of how Privacy Shield works. We need to cover by this first annual review several important topics. One of them will be whether there are or not positive or negative changes in the American legislation. That's why I wanted to make sure here that there are no changes in relation to Presidential Policy Directive 28 and what can we expect from the possible amendment of 702 section of Visa Act. There will be a chapter describing how this is functioning day-to-day basis, which covers the tasks which all the authorities have in running the Privacy Shield, because we have 7 state authorities on American side. We have the Commission Data Protection Authorities on European side. We have the Federal Committee of Trade also here. I shouldn't forget it. And all of us have some homeworks. And if Privacy Shield works in the way it is described in the adequacy decision, the data will be fully protected. If there will be loopholes in the day-to-day practice, it might happen that there will be also, I think, intolerable loopholes in the protection itself. That's why we need to make sure that it works. We will use several channels. One will be from the official places, from the state administration. We will give our input, the data protection authorities and so on. The second important channel is the one you asked about. It's the information from the businesses themselves, the companies which have certified under Privacy Shield. We will ask, among others, one crucial question: how many times have you been requested to provide the private data of Europeans to the state bodies, to the national security bodies in the United States? And we will ask some other questions related to this security area. We wanted, when we negotiated Privacy Shield, to have such reporting as an obligation for the companies, and it was not accepted by American side. So now and also it's one of my tasks here, I try to convince the representatives of the businesses to give us such information upon our request. I have up to now very positive answers. The businesses need us keep running the Privacy Shield, so I don't envisage any bigger problem here. The third channel will be from the side of civil society, and I spoke to NGOs on both on American and European side. They are rather critical, and they have concerns. The main concerns of American NGOs, as well as, in fact, the European ones, that the priority to ensure security will overall the priority to ensure privacy of people, that it will simply become imbalanced in United States under Mr. Trump's administration. I don't have such signs yet, but we are vigilant, especially on this issue. The fourth channel will be media, whistleblowers. I don't know what else, because what I want to reflect in the annual review, it's not only the evidence of how Privacy Shield is running, but also something which I call real feel. Whether here is the atmosphere in the United States which gives us necessary assurance that the private data of Europeans will be protected in the way we protect it on European soil. Because this is the core purpose of Privacy Shield, to ensure the essentially equivalent protection of data when it's transferred to United States.
Commissioner, I think we have time for one more question. I see right in the front, and I'm going to add 2.5 questions.
This is my trick, to give a long answer, not to get any further questions.
You have discovered the secret. I wanted to ask, as the judicial process is also working its way in Europe, how that impacts the review, if it impacts the review. If we have some judicial cases in Ireland and elsewhere, I'd welcome that thought. Sir, please welcome your question.
Commissioners, thank you for being here this morning. I'm Professor Relly in Council of the Embassy of Spain. I would like, first of all, thank you for your interest and your sensitivity on the e-evidence issue. I think the Commission is doing very well and is starting working on this topic. Just would like to know if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on your conversations with internal sessions on the topic, and if encryption was included on your side. Thank you very much.
Encryption was included from Mr. Sessions' side. It was quite obvious that this is a big issue here, but this is a big issue also in European Union. I have in my portfolio the duty to find a solution for e-evidence. Just to understand fully the topic, the European prosecutors, the judges, the police, they complain that if they need to speed up with the prosecution or investigation of some cross-border cases, they have a lot of obstacles to get the e-evidence from the cloud. And I am sure we need to introduce some simple rules for European Union which will help the law enforcement authorities to have a clear path to get the evidence on time. And you know, time matters extremely under the terrorist threats. we need to be much quicker. And the companies also themselves call for legal certainty. They themselves call for legislation in this. So, and this is quite extraordinary because they usually do not like us to regulate. But this shows that this is a serious issue for all. On encryption, we also work on a proposal how to solve this problem in European Union. We discussed it with Mr. Sessions, and we promised to each other to come back to this in June in case he comes to Malta to the EU-U.S. high-level conference, and that this will be one of the points for discussion. We are facing the same global challenges, and it is quite, I think, efficient to join forces and to find the same solutions. So same or comparable, because I think that the good and the bad coming or stemming from digital area is equal on both sides of Atlantic.
Commissioner, thank you so much. I know the entire audience joins me in issuing an invitation for you to return to us in September after you complete the annual review for your assessment and your thoughts. And I thought your line, "We need to get this right together," is the perfect motto for the U.S. and the EU and its collaboration. Please join me in thanking the Commissioner for her excellent
Thank you very much.
So if you'll give us one moment, we're going to do a little switcheroo here, and we're going to take our podium down, and I'm going to welcome our panelists forward here. So Emery and Jim and Renat, if you can come on up here, maybe I'll sit here in the middle. Yep, you can come right here. We're going to take that down in a minute. Thank you. Well, one of our favorite things to do is after we have really important opening remarks, we like to unpack them a little bit, roll up our sleeves and dive into the details. And I cannot think of three people more suited to helping us understand these important details. To my left, we have Emery Simon, who is the counselor to BSA, the Software Alliance, which is a group of leading software and computer companies. Emery was the executive director of the Alliance to Promote Software Innovation prior to his work at the Software Alliance, and before that, the Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Intellectual Property, and was our principal U.S. negotiator on intellectual property. So, Emery, we'd be grateful for your sense of where the private sector is. After we hear from Emery, we will turn to Renata Nicolai, who is the Chief of Cabinet to Commissioner Jourová. We always like to say it is hard to follow your boss. So we appreciate, Renata, you being here. You have been addressing so many of these issues. You led the unit of interinstitutional and international relations at DG Justice between 2011 and 2014. You have served as a key advisor to the former EU High Representative Cathy Ashton. You've worked with the European Parliament and working on trade issues, working for two former trade commissioners. So you have the justice, the trade, the whole package. And then after Renata provides us with some comments, we will turn to my colleague, Dr. Jim Lewis, Senior Vice President and directs our Technology Policy Program. Full disclosure, Jim and I are office mates, so we get to talk these issues all day long, and now we just invite you into that conversation. Before joining CSIS, Jim had a distinguished career as a U.S. Foreign Service officer at the State Department, and then as a senior executive at the Commerce Department, dealing with a broad range of political, military, intelligence issues. He's the go-to guy in my book on all these issues. So, Jim, we're grateful to have you here. So, Emery, start us off here. The Commissioner gave us a lot of good content of what this review will look like, and Privacy Shield, and some of the key issues on data protection. Where are some of your companies within the Soft Alliance? Where's their thinking right now, as much as you can help us understand that?
So thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Kudos to the Commissioner for her leadership and commitment. She's done a fantastic job of making sure that transatlantic data flows can continue. So it's a wonderful thing. To her staff as well, who work hard on this. Data has become sort of the indispensable component of today's economic activity. And without data flows, a lot of economic activity stops. And that's true from pharmaceuticals and manufacturing to services to across the board. The recognition that the Commissioner has brought that this is not simply an issue of software, hardware, data, technology, but of economy as a whole, I think adds an enormous depth of perspective and importance. So companies hate a four-letter word. And the four-letter word they hate the most is risk.
Risk.
And what they want in terms of U.S.-European data relations is predictability. Each of the technology companies I work with and companies generally are law-abiding. They are challenged by having to abide by the laws of different jurisdictions in which they operate. They certainly respect the fundamental right of privacy in Europe and want to abide by European rules. They also want to abide by U.S. laws, whether it comes to law enforcement or national security or other areas. And the challenge is how to reconcile all of that in a way that gets at the core question from a company perspective, which is trust. It's user trust, customer trust, those who empower us to be stewards of important information, and how do we make sure that we earn that trust over time. The Privacy Shield is an indispensable element of creating stability and predictability. The fact that it is now in place is an extraordinary achievement, and kudos to all who worked on it. Preserving it is indispensable. The challenges to the bilateral relationship on data flows go beyond just the Privacy Shield, however. There are a number of court cases now pending, one in Ireland brought by Max Schrems on a second component of how you get data flows going, which is model contractual clauses under Article 26. That litigation is ongoing. That question will, more likely than not, the Irish court will pose a question to the European Court of Justice, similar to the question that it took up in the Schrems 1 case. It has implications for Privacy Shield, which has been part of the litigation. There have been a number of suits filed in Europe as well, challenging the Privacy Shield by a French group and an Irish group. Unclear where those cases will go, but those challenges, I think, will continue. We look to the full package, including, as the Commissioner correctly noted, doing the right thing in the U.S. Preserving PPD 28 is important. The ombudsman that was created under the Shield is really important. What we do with legislative initiatives in the national security area need to be smart and measured. They need to protect our national security, but they also need to take into account of not disrupt our economic security. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. You really raised, and the Commissioner echoed it, getting the balance right of privacy, security, economy. It's your job, right, Renata? Every day you have to factor in that balance. How's the balance working in Europe?
Well, actually, I think we are making quite a good, step ahead on that balance. And if I could just kind of, maybe refer to 3 work strands along those lines. The whole idea of the GDPR and the reform of the EU data protection regime, which was outdated because the directive that currently applies dates back to '95, and that was, of course, a totally different age when it comes to the internet governance, when it comes to how we look at data privacy issues in the world. And I think there we were very much driven by the idea of striking that right balance and that triangle between security, business interests, and looking at data protection as a fundamental right, which is what we have to do in Europe because it's part of our Charter of Fundamental Rights. But from the outset, we have really pursued this triple objective. And I think when you look at the outcome of the GDPR, that's exactly what we are trying to do there. And that's what makes the implementation phase now, to get ready for the Big Bang Day on the 24th of May 2018, so important. Because, for instance, from a business perspective, one of the big achievements of the GDPR reform is that it's going to be a uniform law for the entire 28 member states. But that's why we have to watch now very carefully what's happening in individual member states when they're trying to adjust their legal concept to the new rules. If we let that go and if we keep this totally unobserved, then of course there is at least a risk that we would, in May 2018, be faced with, again, very different approaches to that. We can, of course, always come in later on and infringe the member states, but that would be second best. It would be best to kind of really have a proactive approach in this implementation phase. And this should come as some comfort also to the US audience, that we are seeing here an unprecedented, frankly, implementation phase of a key piece of legislation in the European Union, which is also so an important foundation for our digital single market, which is one of the key pillars of the current Commission, the Juncker Commission, as a key objective to achieve for the European Union. That we are, even after adoption of the reform, we are actually seeing a very active discussion with member states, with stakeholders, to get this right. As the Commissioner was saying, for the transatlantic, that applies on the GDPR reform internally. So every month, for instance, we have all the experts from the member states coming back to Brussels to compare notes on how they are doing in implementing the rules. I've never seen that on any of the other big proposals that we've done, but I think it's the only way to get this right, because not only do we need to watch that there is a uniform application, but also we need to watch that we get this right against the background of the digital revolution we are all witnessing, so that we are not missing any development that we want to capture, for instance, by providing additional guidelines together with our data protection authorities to have everybody, including the business, ready on the Big Bang Day. But I think also in terms of, sending the right messages to the international partners, it's important that, building on the very successful experience of having come to a conclusion on the Privacy Shield with a partner as important as the US, we have now developed an international strategy on data protection. And because we feel that we have a lot to contribute. If you look at the world, there's more than 100 countries in the world who are in some form or another debating their data protection regime. And when you look at the details of it, very often this is driven by two kind of aspects. When they are reforming their data protection regime, either because they didn't have one at all, or because they have an outdated one, they are looking at what are the right sets of rights and obligations for the individuals and for the respective business partners, one thing. And the other thing is, do I have an independent authority at hand to kind of make sure that there is a supervision? Well, here, our data protection regime that we have developed in Europe is a very good inspiration. I'm not saying everybody should do it like we have done it, but it certainly we can certainly contribute to a broad global debate on the future of and maybe also global governance of the internet. And there are partners, and we've just launched 2 weeks ago adequacy negotiations with Japan, who are really also interested in coming to a similar approach like we found the one with the United States on the Privacy Shield. And we are ready, now that we have our data protection rules ready and getting ready for their entry into force, to actually deploy that. And then maybe a final point, when you look at getting the balance right, of course, we are all, just, observing with sometimes with interest, but also a little bit with concern, how fast the internet and all the challenges, also from a legal perspective, that they present, how fast they are developing. And working in the justice area, I can only tell you that whatever you touch, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's civil justice, whether it's consumer protection, all the areas we very much deal with on a daily basis in our portfolio are very much influenced by the digital dimension to it. If you're talking consumer protection today in Europe, we are trying to make our rules fit for the digital age, because I think we are not fully there to see what is the right kind of approach without hurting innovation, because also there the balance is about providing the possibilities for innovation in the sector, because that will sustain the growth and the jobs creation that we all need on both sides of the Atlantic, but also to have the trust that was mentioned earlier, the trust of the consumers in the digital environment. So we have to discuss what are the right kind of rights and obligations of platforms in that. Is our legal structure equipped for that, or do we have to adjust it? We heard from the Commissioner everything we do on electronic evidence. I mean, that's a challenge. In today's criminal proceedings, electronic evidence becomes more and more important, not only in big terrorist cases, no, everywhere. And, our classical territorial structures for jurisdiction do not quite fit when you have the kind of the data in the cloud. And we should kind of try to find the right approaches to that. And last but not least, we have a lot to do in Europe when you look at our very successful internal market to address the still persisting barriers in this internal market, to really break them down and to facilitate and to fully unleash the potential of, for instance, electronic commerce, within the EU. So lots of things to do, which are all, linked to the internet and to the digital age, and where we have to adjust our legal requirements in the right balance of providing the right incentives for business to continue to be innovative, but also providing the right sets of legal security for the customers and for the consumers to maintain their trust in it.
Thank you. And I think your point about the technological, the speed of change, not only the legal system struggles to keep up, the policy struggles to keep up. And Jim, you have been a real thought leader on trying to have the policy keep up with it. What is your perspective as you've looked at these issues closely?
Well, I want to pick up on the comment about the digital revolution, because I think that's exactly right. We're adjusting to a new environment where how we do business, how we secure ourselves, how we create innovation has changed by these technologies, right? And so we need a solution that works transatlantically and preferably globally to protect rights and yet at the same time enable commerce and innovation. For me, the issue of speed is a little different, though, and maybe I've just been tracking this too long. The technology does not change that fast. It's not that technology changes too fast, it's that governments are too slow. And so one of the things we've been talking about is this generational. I'll give you a tip. When I go up to the Hill, I'll look to see on the desk of the member if they still have a yellow legal pad, right? And that's a sign they're still doing things by pen. And over time, the number of people who do not feel comfortable with this digital revolution is decreasing. The number of people, and some call them digital natives, I'm not sure that's quite the right way to describe them, but I think as governments realize the centrality of these issues and the need that the digital revolution touches all aspects of what we do, they apparently like that line.
You're getting applause already,
yeah,
and you're not even
right.
done.
So I'll just repeat it. The digital revolution touches all aspects of what we do. We will see this gap between policy, law, and technology narrow. So I'm very optimistic about that. The commissioner raised, I think, some of the key issues, right? Privacy Shield, what looked like to be a desperate measure perhaps a year or two ago is now, I think, largely a success, right? The issue of evidence is very difficult because we are still using early 20th century models for evidentiary exchange. And it's a touchy one because it touches on national sovereignty. States are very protective of their sovereignty. That's understandable, but we should be able, certainly between Europe and the U.S., to find better models. The issue of encryption came up. We put out a report a couple months ago that looked at the actual use of encryption that suggested it's not yet a major problem, but we do need to think about whether it would become one. The issues there are what you could call full disk encryption. Everyone has a mobile phone. Some of you have the ability to encrypt everything on your mobile phone in a way that makes it inaccessible to third parties. That could be a problem. That's the San Bernardino case. The other one are these instant messaging, the messaging applications, which some of them, like WhatsApp, now offer encryption that can pose challenges to law enforcement, right? And so we want to think about how do we deal with that. But to conclude, many of you travel around the world and you realize that with a few exceptions, like Japan or Australia, New Zealand, how countries approach these problems is very different with those exceptions. And so we are looking now in many areas about in a much more conflictual world, in a world where the security situation has become much worse, it's more important that the like-minded countries, the countries who share values about fundamental rights, can find ways to work together. And so I'm very pleased with the Commissioner's remarks. I think we all should be on the need for continued conversation, for finding ways to be partners. If we can't be partners, we're going to be in much worse shape. But I am confident now, in looking at the European reaction to many things, that that partnership and that conversation will be a source of strength for both the EU and the U.S.
Jim, thanks. Emery, I wanted to come back to you because I'd love, again, from the Software Alliance, again, general sense of the encryption question, because that has really been quite a dynamic conversation between the private sector and government. And then I'm going to ask you to put your old USTR hat back on. If you were sitting back in your old job, how would all of this look to you?
Well, let's take the easy question first.
Okay.
On encryption. So encryption is an indispensable part of security systems. It's what everybody relies on. I rely on it, you rely on it, businesses rely on it, governments rely on it. Bad people do a good job of being able to get through all kinds of security systems. Our companies and others try to stay steps ahead of them. The better you, the harder it is sometimes for law enforcement and other officials to get at evidence, and Jim points this out correctly. A lot of the evidence gathering is still 20th century approaches rather than 21st century approaches.
Early 20th century.
Early 20th century. That's because we're both quite old.
Young at heart.
The wrong solution is to dumb down the technology. Because when you dumb down the technology, you're hurting everybody. You're exposing everybody. The right solution is to do much better capacity building on the part of law enforcement. And one of the challenges that we have is that we have underinvested, at least in the U.S., in law enforcement capabilities on forensics in the data world. So that is a matter of cooperation. As I mentioned earlier, every one of our members is a good citizen. Every one of our members wants to do the right thing. We also want to maintain the trust of our customers. And then maybe one other point on encryption, which is encryption is indispensable to a lot of stuff. So as an example, critical infrastructure, right? Our electric grid, our water systems, our power systems. These all rely on security systems that rely on encryption to protect them. So when we dumb down encryption, we're exposing ourselves in so many ways that we actually need to think through quite carefully. So on your trade question, and I'm very glad that Renata raised the global perspective. We're talking today about a bilateral U.S.-European context, but data doesn't respect political borders. That's part of the nature and the reality. Data is stored and processed where it's most efficient, where there's best capacity. That's what we all want to happen. We want the flow to occur seamlessly. We are in an era, as Renata points out, where a lot of countries are looking at these areas. I worry that it opens the door for protectionism, for economic considerations that are not about the fundamental right of privacy, but about commercial mercantilist policies. We need to guard very strongly against that. So in the 20th century, when I was a trade negotiator, we looked at the world and we said, where are the future economic growth engines? And we added to trade regimes 3 elements. We added investment, we added services, and we added intellectual property. As we look at trade regimes today and global economies and where the growth is going to come, not just for us, but for Europe and elsewhere, it's going to be a data-driven set of activities. Predictability, barriers to the data flows, other impediments, protectionist measures, are to our mutual detriment. So we need to figure out ways to develop trade rules that guarantee the possibility or safeguard the possibility of data making the big bang contribution while also being respectful of national security and privacy. But we can't let national security and privacy become a justification, a rationalization, a way to just get past the obligations. So we need to keep them in balance in a way that makes sense.
And Renate, that was exactly the point I wanted to raise, is you're talking about the reform process that's happening within 28 member states in some ways. Either they're renewing themselves, thinking through what they are interested in. I'm wondering if there would be some interest helping us understand.
They applaud him and they shut the door on me.
Yeah. No comment.
There we go.
They just want to get in. They're so interested in the conversation. If you could help us sort of where you see some of the most exciting reform efforts, if there are particular member states that you're thinking are doing something. Again, I think this is an opportunity for best practices, to be honest with you, and that in some ways that's driving the general reform. And then secondly, I have to ask the question, how does Brexit impact this? So the UK will be going through this May 24th, 2018, but not in 2019. Help us understand that, if there's an element here we should be understanding. Sorry,
I was wondering whether we did.
Sorry.
I mean, on the kind of EU 28 and within the EU, dimension. I mean, I think it's very important if you look at Europe these days to try to figure out what are the binding kind of, big objectives that really glue all the 28 closely together. Because of course, we are in the European Union, again, at a quite important crossroads, like we have been in the 60 years of our kind of development here and there, and we'll get over it, but, it is challenging. But I think if you look at the kind of the key projects of the current Commission, which have been very much echoed both by the other institutions, the European Parliament and the Council, so the heads of states of all 28, then something like the Digital Single Market project is really something that glues everybody together. And of course, here you have a very different kind of, ways of looking at it. If you look at it from some of the Nordic countries, like if you take Finland or Estonia, you have really champions on something that we call e-governance. I mean, these are some of them are very kind of, recently independent societies who have immediately made a jump ahead into the digital age. If you're in Estonia, this is a country that you should bear in mind because they will have the presidency as of July
1st, right?
So this is everything is E there. You won't find any kind of, minister with any kind of paper anymore. And so this is really like in their genes. And this is a very interesting impulse and inspiration for the rest of the 28 because some of them are not yet fully there. On the other hand, if you look at, let's say, the industrial base kind of member states, like the country I know best, Germany, you have, for instance, with Industry 4.0, quite a huge dimension of trying to, give a push to the fourth industrial revolution, the digital revolution of the industrial base, the Internet of Things, and to really make that link between old classic industrial production but the digital opportunities. Then you have others who are more kind of, pioneers in the modern security aspects of it. UK is certainly one of them. And that's the kind of, I think, the dimension that I see, that I find very vibrant in Europe right now, that everybody is kind of bound by this big theme of digital single market, which has all these aspects of the business side, not to forget the fundamental rights aspect to it, and also the security aspect. And they all kind of, talk to each other. We have these projects, this holistic approach to look at all these different aspects of the digital single market, and I find that's really quite a boost. Brexit. Well, first of all, the UK remains a member until, within the next 2 years. So everything that we do, frankly, in data protection is at the moment totally unaffected by it. So we are partners, and I can't see any kind of signal, in any of the debates that we are having amongst justice ministers, that we are having at the working group level, that we are having with stakeholders. I don't see any departure in the UK, from the perspective that they want to be ready for the Big Bang Day in May 2018 to be fully ready for the entry into force of the new data protection rules. It's also fair to say that the UK have been, throughout the process, both from the business side but also from the governance side, been a very important partner in bringing about the data protection reform solution. Because they have quite an important business kind of strategy on that, and they have a very strong tradition of the fundamental rights protection. Of course, when it comes to what is the future, we will have, if you look ahead, I think you will have to distinguish three phases. I mean, there will have to be in 2 years a withdrawal agreement, just to mark the point that the UK is no longer member of the EU. But that will be accompanied very, very clearly and very certainly with transitional arrangements to kind of, help us bridge the time until the third phase comes in, which is then the future arrangement between the EU and the UK. And especially in the area that we are kind of dealing with on a daily basis, the whole justice area, whether it's data protection, whether it's criminal justice, we have a lot of kind of tools at our disposal where we have a mutual interest in making sure that they continue to apply in that transitional phase. But that's, of course, going to be the result of the very intense negotiations that we are going to have in the next 2 years. But that's how I would map this out. But on data protection, at the moment, there is no kind of, reason to panic, because we are, in this together, and we are going to make the GDPR a success together, and we are also going to do the review of the Privacy Shield together. I mean, they remain a member, a full-fledged member, at least, within the next 2 years.
Jim, I have one final question, then I want to definitely bring our audience into it. So one of the critical avenues of review that the EU will use is civil society and its reaction, and NGOs and media and civil space. I have to tell you, I was, as I was listening to some of the public testimony yesterday with the Senate Intelligence Committee, in some ways, technology and automation is also shaping public opinion on a whole lot of things, sometimes falsely. I would just love, and anyone else wants to toss in on that, civil society, and we know that there are very strong views, and we respect those strong views. It's not enough, but are they getting the right information? Are they getting that balanced, factual information? Are forces shaping our public opinion that perhaps it's difficult to really gauge adequately civil society's reactions to these very complex issues?
Let me first raise an analogy that I was thinking about while my colleagues were speaking. And so you can have some fun by comparing data flows to financial flows, right? And so you could see what it would look like to say, I want my money to stay in my country, right? And you can point to successful economies that have taken that position, like North Korea and Cuba and Venezuela. Oh, wait. So we need to find a similar model. It's not a perfect analogy, but there has to be some way for data to flow to enable economic growth, right? And what that will look like, sometimes I say Bretton Woods. I don't think that's the right model, but we have to find those flows. So the financial model is a good one to think about. It's not a perfect analogy, but it works. I was thinking, even before Heather asked me the questions, that you're so polite that I need to tone you up a little bit. So let me start by saying no one in the room should have any doubt that Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act will pass. Okay, it will pass, right? Ironically, were it not to pass, there would be fewer constraints on collection because the authorities that govern collection would default to less robust constraints, right? So you want it to pass, right? We want it to pass because we want to be able to continue to provide for the security of American citizens and our allies. And so the real question is not pass, not pass. The real question is how much parsley will we put around it? There'll be something perhaps to make the NGOs happy. My advice to people on the Hill has been just pass it, unchanged. Just renew it. Just do it. But they will renew it, whether it's with or without parsley. I've enjoyed the debate we've seen in the last month or so. Remember, asking an NGO about surveillance is like asking a vegetarian about bratwurst, right? And so, they're just, it's really hard for them to, I guess it's, it's just hard for them. And it's not clear to me how useful that is. And one of the things that struck me in the recent debate is you had all this hysteria over what they called mass surveillance. I'm going to call it hysteria in the last couple of years. And it's led into the debate we have now. And so there's this idea of inadvertent collection. There is no such thing as inadvertent collection. To be collected, you have to be, in these sorts of instances involving FISA, you have to be, there's of course two ends to the conversation, right? One end of the conversation has to be a foreign intelligence agent, a terrorist, or someone involved in proliferation, right? That's it, folks. Now on the other end, and by the way, when you're picked up on the other end, I'm probably unique in the room, or maybe not. I've seen my own intercepts, right? And they're very funny, because as you read them, you're thinking, geez, this guy sounds really familiar, right? And then you're like, oh! But it just says U.S. person. And so the first time this happened to me, I thought, well, I'll see how well the system works. I tried to find out if I was me, right? By saying, who is the U.S. person? And of course the answer you get is, do you have a warrant, right? Do you have grounds for knowing that? Have you persuaded a court? And of course the answer was no. So there is no such thing as inadvertent collection unless you're somehow connected to a person of concern from a national security perspective. And that's where the privacy debate has been unhelpful, and that's where the NGOs have been unhelpful, because you have this sense that there's this mass collection out there, and it's just not true, right? So I think we'll have to have this debate. I hate to bring it up because this has been such a happy conversation so far. If there's ways to probably amend 702 to make it more comfortable for a European audience, but amend and go away are different. And so you may see amendments, but you will not see any administration abandon a crucial tool for our security.
So Renata, now you see why Jim and I have fabulous conversations in the hallway. We're just bringing you into them. Emery, you want to come in, and I know you want to respond.
So just 2 points. One, Jim, you're absolutely right. 702 is actually a safeguard on what can be done. It may or may not be adequate. We can debate that, but it's not a free-for-all. So 702 is important. Renewal and continuation of 702 is really indispensable for both us here in the U.S. as well as within the context we're talking about. On NGOs and others, there's an awful lot of scrutiny of what the NSA does. The NSA is not a unique entity around the world. Lots of other entities do very similar things, and there's very little scrutiny of what they do. One of my frustrations in the discussions we have with Europeans on privacy issues is there's a lot of scrutiny of U.S. practice. There's very little scrutiny of European practice. And the debate, I think, should acknowledge the fact that we all have legitimate national security objectives, which are right and to be pursued by us, by France, by Germany, by Estonia. And we need to figure out balanced ways to talk about all this. So that's part of the dialogue, and as we mature in these discussions, and we are at early stages of these discussions, I think that's an important element to bring into it, which is everybody's got national security concerns. We all hate terrorists. We all hate the threats to our safety and security. We all need to do the right thing to stop them. Collaborating is a good thing. Sometimes emphasis is placed on only one of the fundamental rights without fully taking into consideration that there are probably 15 or 20 different fundamental rights in Europe, some of which have to do with security as well.
Fire away.
Yeah, well, I think what we all observe when we come back to the kind of the idea of the kind of triangle and finding the right balance, that depending on what happens, what external factor we're just dealing with, the pendulum swings a little bit more in the one direction or in the other. And I think we've seen all that in the last couple of years. We had a Snowden factor, then we had several unfortunate kind of security threat factors, and I think it's our role, at least where I sit, to always kind of bear in mind that there is a need for a triangle. I would totally disagree with your assessment that we are not having that debate on national security in Europe. You have several national parliaments who have inquiry committees to look into the activities of their national security bodies. It is true, and I assume that that's not always easy from where you sit to fully understand that you have to look into what is the role of the European level there and what is the role of the national level there. But that we don't have a debate on the limitations and the necessary oversight of national security authorities would be wrong. That there is no kind of control by the judiciary is also wrong, because whatever happens in national security areas and member states is, for instance, full up to the scrutiny of the European Court in Strasbourg, and we had very important decisions on that. And you have in our European Union structure with the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, which has been a key pillar in kind of helping us to make step-by-step progress in our European integration project, because you need the rule of law established, and that's where the courts come in with their checks and balances, as we all know. The European Court of Justice has really become a constitutional court also on fundamental rights since we have the Charter. And of course, the fundamental right to privacy is one of the very important ones. You are right, and I fully agree with you that as we all have learned, those of us who are lawyers in constitutional law, this is about weighing also different, fundamental rights or other interests such as national security. But it would be an illusion and it would be naive to think on your side of the Atlantic that the European Court of Justice will not continue to play that role. And it plays that role not only vis-a-vis, what we as European institutions do, but also what member states do. The recent judgment, on Tele2 was a clear kind of, judgment on an activity by a member state. So this is going to be a factor that we have to deal with, and whatever we do on the Privacy Shield and whatever we do in the future on dealing with the balancing act between privacy, security interests, and business interests. The European Court of Justice has found an important and very honorable role as a constitutional court for fundamental rights that they will continue to play.
Jim, you want to jump in?
So just real quickly, because I hope we can get to some audience questions. I've met a couple times with the Bundestag committee that's investigating the NSA. And the first time I met with them, which was probably about 2 years ago, I told them, when you get to the end of this path, you are going to find a 3-letter agency. And one of the letters will be N, but the letters will not be NSA. And so I think we've seen that confirmed now, that what NSA does, as Emery said, is what all countries do. And European agencies spy on Americans. So I think one of the words we want to think about as we move in this debate is the word that you'll hear in many areas, I think, from the new administration, which is reciprocity. You want to be protected, I want to be protected too. I know what happens to me when I go to some European countries. You think you know what happens when you come to the U.S. I don't see the same level of protections in some European countries that you have here, right? And it's improved. When the Snowden debate started, there was a profound lack of oversight over intelligence activities in some European countries. That's improving. I think it's outside the remit of the Commission, but I would focus on the word reciprocity. But look, we're basically the same, right? We have the same rights, we have the same beliefs. Sure, there's differences, but this should not be an issue on division. This should just be another part of the conversation that we work out on security and on privacy. So I'm looking at this since Snowden over the last 3 or 4 years, very positive trend.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You've testified, and I think this conversation is so critical. It's not easy, but it's a really important one. All right, promise. Time to bring our audience in. Oh, good, I see lots of hands. So what we'll do is collect a few questions, and then we'll return back to the panel. And I see a very active row right there, Jonah. And so again, please, and sometimes you have to put that microphone very close to your mouth. Please identify yourself and your question.
Hi there. Thank you for the panel for a great discussion. Carl Cook with Norfolk Grumman Corporation. I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on one issue. Jim, you did a conference on this about a year and a half ago on the Sony hack and the fact of destructive malware. And just, it's not a question of arguably if this happens again, but when it's going to happen again, and the target could be European citizens, could be European companies, global companies doing business in Europe. Is the privacy shield and the protections in place robust enough to respond? How will the EU respond? Will they respond as a body, as an individual member state, if, for example, it's primarily a German company or an Estonian company? Just a couple thoughts on that, please. Thank you.
Wonderful. If you could just pass the microphone down to your colleague. Thank you.
Hello again. Thank you all very much. I'm Rachel Pfeffer from Congressional Research Service. And you seem to hold up the Privacy Shield as a potential model globally. And I'm wondering how scalable is that if you have a Privacy Shield with the U.S., if you're looking at doing a review with Japan and every other country, how feasible is that to do with every other country with an annual review of implementation, etc., versus something such as, I think it was Jim talked about reciprocity, and you look at the APEC cross-border privacy rules, the CBPR, which seems a little more flexible and scalable. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts as well as the other panelists on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And
I'll
who else
go back
on the
to our panelists. Any other question? Okay, why don't I have our panelists start? Maybe just pass that over. Jim, do you want to? We'll just work our way down the line.
No, but
No, sorry.
There is a linkage between the protections you need for privacy and the protections you need for network security. So clearly the Sony executives, and now we've seen many others, had unhappy experiences regarding the privacy of their emails. I don't know if there's enough overlap there. I don't know if it's really, it's not a focus here for the privacy discussion. There's some overlap. You can't have privacy without cybersecurity, but clearly it's not enough. On the, I can't read my writing on the second question.
So
scalable.
Scalable and sort of the globalization, if you will, of this type of.
Well, that's one of the reasons I like the currency model, the financial model, because we will ultimately, we're at the early stages of adjusting to the fact that you have global networks now and you have a new global infrastructure, and we need to think how countries will relate to it and look at things like security and privacy. We don't have a vehicle for talking about that. I don't think the UN is a adequate vehicle. We need to find a way, and so privacy shield discussions are good between the US and Europe, but how would we broaden it? And the concept of privacy is very different, as you all know, in many parts of the world. In one country I was in, I asked them, so what's your word for privacy? And they said privacy. I said, no, come on, don't tell me the English word, tell me in your language. He said, no, we don't have a concept for privacy, we just use your word. That's going to make it difficult to come to an agreement. This will take years. Yeah. But Privacy Shield is a good place to start. Right? So scalable ultimately, but it fits into this larger, and I think you raised it, Renato, the governance of this digital revolution.
Indeed. So I mean, on the kind of Sony cybersecurity broader question, I would also just echo, I don't think that the Privacy Shield is a panacea for everything. And I think, these are the threats that kind of are out there and that we are already addressing with key strategic partners, such as between the EU and the US, but also more globally. We will see more variations of these threats. If you look at the Internet of Things, there's a whole kind of potential new threat dimension that will come our direction, and I think we have no easy solutions for that right now. But I think we would overload the kind of Privacy Shield if we said this is also the solution for that. And the same for your question. I mean, let's just kind of go back for 1 second and say what the Privacy Shield is. It is an expression of something that is in our European legislation, which is a possibility for us in the European Commission to take a unilateral decision of a finding that declares another country's structure as essentially equivalent in terms of the level of protection. That's what it is. It is also the result of a negotiation on several years of negotiation, but the Privacy Shield decision that was then published in the official journal, accompanied by all these kind of, commitments that we succeeded in the negotiations, remains what it is, a unilateral decision, which is also important to bear in mind for what is the annual review about. If, and I don't suggest that we are going to get there, but if ever, we were to see a real kind of, different trend and, backtracking on the foundation, the very, very foundations on which the Privacy Shield was built, we have a very clear provision in the Privacy Shield unilateral adequacy decision that we will have to suspend. So that's what it is. It's not kind of, only the result, or it's not an international treaty or so. It's really a unilateral decision, and this is the expression of what is in our Chapter 5 of our data protection rules, which is one element of facilitating trade data flows. Not the only one, there can be others, but it's one of the very privileged ones because it gives huge benefits to the companies on both sides to actually have the commercial data flowing. So that brings me to your question. No, it cannot be a model for everybody. It will, and if you read the strategy that we kind of published on the 10th of January on our international perspective on data protection, it makes it very clear. It will only work with partners where you have a lot of commonalities. I mean, Japan is an obvious candidate because Japan has been reforming its data protection regime and has taken inspiration from Europe. So honestly, we have a very good basis to build on for a potential kind of, adequacy decision at the end of our dialogue that we have just, started with them. South Korea could be another one. It's also driven by, the economic links. I mean, with South Korea, we have a free trade agreement that's very successfully running. With, Japan, we are in the finalization of our free trade agreement negotiations. So, you will always have criteria that will kind of, drive you to consider that this could be a partner for adequacy. But I wouldn't apply that to many others, If you look around the world, I can see many, many partners with whom we would not even want to consider that, But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a global dialogue. Whether Bretton Woods is the right concept, I don't know. Whether UN is the right one, even though they have now a high-level person, on privacy, I don't know. There's in the Council of Europe an interesting convention that needs to be adapted, to be modernized, which is certainly something that we will want to continue to support. Also now against the background that we have our modern rules, as I said, as a source of inspiration. But I certainly think that, whatever concept you can have in the G7, in the G20, to kind of, lift the level of mutual understanding and of, having dialogue on that is very useful.
It would certainly seem to me the G7 is a natural place for that to begin, to throw my own 2 cents in. Emery.
This is hard stuff because we're not really that good at law enforcement international agreements. So we have MLATs, we have a number of instruments.
Yep.
We are not really good yet at trying to figure out how unruly data flows mesh up with other priorities. The Budapest Convention, the Cybercrime Convention you mentioned, is a possibility of an instrument. It's not the most successful instrument out there. The fact that it exists shows that there's a need. So I think part of the challenge is how to think about this stuff as national security is economic security and economic security is national security. And one of the things is how to cross-pollinate these sets of considerations in a way that that these communities, which have grown up with different priorities, can talk to each other. So is it scalable? I don't know if it's scalable. It's something that creates some predictability internationally. It's good from a business perspective. We tend to write our stuff to the most rigorous requirements, right? So if Europe is the most rigorous place, we will try to follow those practices globally. Not always, but that's the tendency is not to have specific sets of rules for each market. To the extent that we'd have international rules, that'll be a much better thing. I wanted to mention one little thing about access to European courts and what's going on in Europe. So one of the things that we have been working on recently and participating in is the Schrems II case in Ireland. And Judge Costello, who's the judge in that case, asked the question of the DPA's barrister, and the question went like this. You, Mr. Barrister, argue that if you found out the NSA had gathered information about you, your availability to U.S. courts would be limited redress. There'll be some, but...
Yeah.
So now let's flip the question. If I found out that the Irish intelligence service had gathered information about me, what would be my standing before an Irish court? And the answer is none. So when I'm not criticizing the fact there's not oversight, there's not really serious thinking about what the limits are, what I'm suggesting is that when the finger is pointed at the U.S. for lack of redress, that needs to be considered in the context of what kind of redress would a U.S. citizen have in Dublin, in Berlin, in Budapest. And the answer is not a whole lot.
This was, as you can imagine, quite an issue that we discussed in the context of the Privacy Shield negotiations,
Right.
n'est pas? And it's not that black and white. The Fundamental Rights Agency in Vienna has actually done an overview to look at, what kind of standing do you have in certain member states in national security matters, and it's not perfect, but it's not kind of, impossible either. So you have what you have here also. You have kind of, access to justice, but then you have exceptions for national security purposes. In Ireland, I don't have the latest now on their regime. You might be right in what you say, I'm sure. But there are other countries where it's more developed, but it's not a clear-cut case. And just look at our data protection reform proposal. It says in one of the first articles that this is outside of the scope of national security. So, I could have an easy task and simply say, oh, I represent the European Commission. We have no kind of role on national security. But what I'm saying is that there's quite a debate in Europe also on this, and and there is in the national checks and balances systems. You referred them to the inquiry and the Bundestag. There are kind of other kind of pressure points that are put in other member states, whether it's France, whether it's the UK. That's the internal checks and balances system that applies here.
Let me just be clear. I am strongly in favor of redress everywhere, of having standing, of having the right to assert my rights. So we're totally on the same page. There's just an unevenness in a lot of places. And it feels to me that the scrutiny of the U.S. is a little more intense.
Can I ask a very specific question about the Privacy Shield? And I may not have my facts correct. So about 2,000 U.S. companies right now are participating. Is that number where you thought it would be after, this is a big fanfare and big issues? So question number one. Question number two, in some of my own reading, part of the criticism of Privacy Shield as it is today is the self-evaluative component of those U.S. companies. Where is that debate now? So I'll start maybe with Emery. Sort of, are we at a good place where U.S. companies are saying yes and let's participate and more? And how is that self-analysis working?
So 2,000 to me feels about right for this stage. In fact, it feels probably a little more than right. So that's a good thing. It's creating a lot more clarity. It takes companies a little while to figure out how to work within these systems. Privacy Shield is one of 3 ways under European law. The other 2 are binding corporate rules and model clauses. Model clauses is what the Irish case is about. Very few companies have binding corporate rules. So Privacy Shield is in fact the primary vehicle, the right vehicle, the necessary vehicle. On compliance, which is kind of your question, I think companies are figuring it out. Companies are, at least companies I work with, really want to do the right thing. I mean, they're basically law-abiding entities. And they're not trying to skirt the system or game the system. They want to work within the system. So I think compliance has not proven to be a huge issue.
Great. Renata?
Yeah, I would agree with that. That we can be quite satisfied with the number of 2,000. I mean, just to compare, under the safe harbor, I think we had in the end 4,500, 5,000 in total, and that was after 10 years. So I mean, after not even a year, to have kind of half of the number under the shield, I think it's quite a good exercise. Given the fact that even, yes, it is still a self-certification system, but it has much more kind of ties to it, It is much more cumbersome compared to the safe harbor, because that was one of the weaknesses, and that required, frankly, a huge step forward and leap ahead in terms of the commitment shown by the Department of Commerce here, because the certification system now requires them to actually have a much more, a bigger scrutiny in kind of, following up with the companies under the shield, and so far so good. I mean, I have no kind of reason, but of course that will also be, I guess, substantially kind of exposed in the joint review, but I have no reason to believe why this is not working in practice. But that means there's a lot more kind of stuff that the companies also have to provide in terms of giving evidence that they are abiding with the rules. But I think it is a success story so far.
I agree.
Great, fantastic. Jim, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. The question is always, what is the alternative to self-certification? And so if you can describe to me an alternative that is not more burdensome, that does not damage commerce or innovation, then go for it. But I don't think there is one. So self-certification always raises these concerns, and you do need to have oversight and scrutiny. When I was a regulator, we used to try and catch one company a year to set an example for the others. But people seem to be following it, so self-certification is probably the best outcome for what we want to do.
Yeah, and I just thank you. I mean, I come back to, I thought the commissioner's remark about we need to get this right together. And I think that's exactly what the last hour and a half was. And it's that balance, it's that rigor, it's that evolution. We want to do the right thing. We're trying to get there. We've got different maybe places of emphasis, but we've got to get there. So thank you to the panelists, and the commissioner is now moved on to her next meeting. But this was a great conversation. I hope we have this back again. I really meant it in the fall to see post-annual review where we come out of it. Hopefully we come out of it and keep this really important conversation. But the three of you made us all a lot smarter. So please join me in thanking our panelists.